So now that we've talked about what a seed is and then some of the other developments that enabled the success of the seed plants, let's look at the gymnosperms, which is our first group of seed plants. The word gymnosperm means naked seed. So these are going to be seeds that are not protected. These are seeds that are going to be produced right there on the sporophyll. And in other words, they're not going to be enclosed by a fruit. And that's something that we're going to see in the second group, which is the angiosperms. But instead, these are exposed seeds. Still, though, this is very successful as far as dispersing offspring. Now, if we look at why the gymnosperms suddenly became so prevalent on the Earth's surface, a lot of it has to do with the fact that at this point in time, the Earth's surface was getting pretty dry. So we see the first fossils of gymnosperms at about 305 million years ago. If you look at our timeline here, the 305 million years ago, which is when we would have started to see the gymnosperms become apparent on the land, is about the same time that the supercontinent was forming. So Pangaea was starting to form back here. We had continents moving together so that we got our big supercontinent. And when that was happening, the climate was getting dry because there's going to be less exposure to the oceans. So it's getting very dry. And gymnosperms are pretty good at surviving dry conditions. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you're talking about the bryophytes and the pterophytes, you have more of a dependence on water for fertilization purposes. We're not going to be so dependent on water for fertilization, at least, once we're talking about the gymnosperms. So they did have advantages for surviving in a dry climate. The seeds were one of those things that was a good thing to them. So they had the seeds, they had pollen, which was going to be beneficial. These are going to have very thick cuticles on their leaves, and their leaves are also needle-like. This is not real great for maximizing your surface area for photosynthesis, but what it does do is it limits the surface area for evaporation of water. So if we're talking about a dry climate, these are all going to be very good things that would help these plants to survive and do very well. As far as our gymnosperm phylum go, we have 4 phylum that are recognized. We're going to go through and talk about each one of these phylums. Cicadophyta is the second largest of the gymnosperm phylums. And this is probably one that you have seen before. You may have a cycad growing in your landscape. Today they're used a lot for landscape plants. These have large cones. Keep in mind that cones are the strobili. So these are where we're going to have our spores produced. So the spores will be right down inside those cones. And these are plants that really thrived during the dinosaur age. So when we're talking about forest of gymnosperms, a lot of those forests that were around when the dinosaurs were around were cycad forest. And this would have been a big food source for dinosaur species. The next group is the Untitled. In this one, we have just 3 individual genera. These are the only ones that are still around today. They're very different from each other, very diverse here, but they are all related to each other based on molecular data. So even though by appearance they look very different, we do know that they do fit together in this one phylum. Ephedra over here, it is where we get ephedrine. So this one is an important source of a drug. We have what we call Welwitschia. This grows in a very dry environment. It has very large blade-like leaves, some of the largest leaves that are known. And then we also have one that is more tree-like, which we call Gnidum, which is where the name of the phylum comes from. So very different in appearance, but they are lumped together based on their molecular data. Gingko Biloba is the smallest of all of the gymnosperm phyla, and that's because there is only one surviving species. So this is the only species left, and this is Gingko Biloba. Gingko Biloba has a very unique appearance to the leaves. They have this fan shape to them, and it is commonly used as a landscape plant, even here in Florida. So Gingko Biloba, they had wide fanning leaves. These leaves have their vascular tissue running throughout them and very maximized for photosynthetic purposes. The largest by far of all of the Gymnosperm phylum is the Coniferous Ida. Coniferous Ida is commonly known as Conifers. And the word conifer has to do with the fact that these are going to produce cones. These cones will be very important for the production of the microsporangia and the megasporangia. Another thing about conifers is that these tend to be evergreen. By evergreen, this means that they do not lose their leaves during any part of the year, during particular seasons. There are a few species that are going to be deciduous. So this is something that applies to most of them. The conifers are very prevalent in forest in the northern hemisphere. And this is because in those locations, because of the altitude and the latitude, you tend to have a shorter growing season. Because it has a shorter growing season, the fact that these keep their leaves year-round is really going to help them do a lot better there than plants that would be shedding their leaves. Because if they were going to shed their leaves, they're not going to have them very long to actually do their photosynthesis and store their food supplies to wait out that time when they don't have leaves. So that is the most prevalent of all of the gymnosperm groups. Let's take a look at a typical life cycle of a gymnosperm. This specifically is a conifer. This would be a pine tree that we're looking at here. The pine tree itself is the mature sporophyte. So that's all going to be sporophyte tissue that you're seeing. And on a pine tree, we have two different cones. We have the cones that are going to produce the pollen, and then we also have the cones that produce the ovules and eventually do hold the seeds. So if we look first at the microsporangia, these would be in the pollen cones. These are going to eventually produce the pollen grains through the process of meiosis. Primarily, we're talking about wind pollination when we're talking about pine trees. They're very tall and their leaves are not very dense, so this is going to be ideal for pine trees. If we're talking about the ovulate cones, or the ones that will produce the ovules, within those, we would have production of the megasporangium. It would undergo meiosis and produce the egg. Now, with the wind pollination, hopefully the pollen grain would be brought into contact with the ovule. So if the pollen grain does come into contact with the ovule, we'll have the germination of the pollen grain, we will get the production of the sperm, and then we would get fertilization take place. The resulting zygote is going to divide by mitosis to give us the embryo. And then we have some of the megaspore tissue, which is going to form the seed coat for this seed. And then if the seed is dispersed in an appropriate location, then it will grow and we'll have a new plant. And that new plant would be a sporophyte, and it could then develop into the mature sporophyte tissue.